There was a shooting during a federal immigration enforcement operation in Minneapolis, and I want to spend some time walking through what we actually know, what is being claimed, and what is still very much unclear. I think this is important because there is already a tremendous amount of spin around this incident. And when something becomes this politicized this quickly, it becomes very difficult to answer the most basic questions. What actually happened? What do we know for sure? And where does interpretation or agenda begin? So that's what I want to do here. I want to go through the facts first. Then I want to provide some context and background. And finally, I want to talk about why this story matters and where it may be headed. Let's start with the facts. Here is what we know. Undisputed. A federal law enforcement officer, an ICE agent, an immigration and customs enforcement officer, shot and killed a 37-year-old woman during an immigration enforcement operation in Minneapolis. That is the most basic and uncontested fact in this case. According to the Minneapolis police chief, who briefed the public shortly after the incident, the woman appeared to be using her vehicle to block a street where ICE agents were conducting an operation. There is partial video footage circulating online. It does not show the full incident. It does not show what led up to it, but it does show the most critical moments. And again, I want to be very clear here. What follows is not speculation. It is simply a description of what is visible in that video. The footage shows a car positioned perpendicular in the middle of a street. At least 3 officers are visible. 2 approach from the driver's side of the vehicle. 1 officer is positioned in front of the car. As the officers approach, the vehicle reverses slightly, just a few feet. One of the officers on the driver's side attempts to open the driver's door. That attempt fails. The car then stops reversing and begins to move forward. Not at a high speed, not aggressively accelerating, but it does begin to move forward. At that point, the officer standing in front of the vehicle fires through the windshield, fatally striking the woman. The vehicle then continues forward briefly before coming to a stop. Based on the available video, police statements, and reporting from the scene, that appears to be the sequence of events. This is still an active investigation, and more information may emerge, but those core facts are broadly agreed upon. Now, before I go further, let me make a very quick pitch. If you value independent, fact-driven analysis of major political and national stories, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel. I publish regularly, and my goal is to call balls and strikes regardless of which political team is at the plate. All right, let's move on to the broader context. At the time of this incident, roughly 2,000 federal agents, mostly ICE, were operating in the Minneapolis area as part of a large immigration enforcement effort. This operation did not appear out of nowhere. It is tied to a major social services fraud and abuse scandal in Minnesota that has grown into a national story. That scandal involves allegations that multiple state-run social services programs were exploited over an extended period of time, resulting in hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. Many of those charged in the case are immigrants, though not exclusively. Several individuals have already been prosecuted and convicted, and additional investigations are ongoing. This issue has been heavily politicized, particularly at the national level. Donald Trump and his allies have repeatedly cited the scandal as evidence of systemic abuse and failure in immigration oversight. In response, a large federal presence was deployed to Minneapolis to investigate immigration-related aspects of the case. That background matters because it explains why there were so many federal agents on the ground and why tensions were already elevated before this shooting occurred. Now we get to the part of the story where consensus breaks down. After the incident, the Department of Homeland Security released a statement describing the shooting in very strong terms. The statement claimed that ICE officers were confronted by rioters, that the woman used her vehicle as a weapon in an attempt to kill law enforcement officers, and that the shooting was a defensive act. The incident was described as an act of domestic terrorism. That framing carries enormous political and legal weight. At the same time, the publicly available video footage is limited. What we can see is roughly a 30-second clip showing officers approaching the vehicle reversing briefly, then moving forward, and shots being fired. Based on that footage alone, it is not possible to independently confirm whether the situation qualifies as a riot or whether the woman was part of a larger coordinated action. It is possible DHS has access to additional evidence that has not been released publicly. But if it does not, then the use of terms like rioter and domestic terrorism raises serious questions. In contrast, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey publicly rejected the federal government's account. He criticized ICE's presence in the city and called for federal agents to leave. While he later urged calm, his remarks were forceful and confrontational, further highlighting the divide between local leadership and federal authorities. So what we have here are two official narratives that are fundamentally incompatible. On one side, the federal government says this was a violent attack on law enforcement that justified lethal force. On the other, local leadership disputes that framing and argues the federal response itself is the problem. That alone guarantees this incident becomes a major national story. And there are additional reasons this story is likely to escalate. Minnesota is already under national scrutiny because of the fraud investigation. Immigration enforcement remains one of the most polarizing political issues in the country. And this shooting occurred near an area that has become symbolically linked to earlier national debates over policing, protest, and the use of force. All of that creates a combustible political environment. When you combine a fatal shooting, immigration enforcement, federal versus local authority, and sharply divided political narratives, the result is almost always prolonged national attention. This is exactly the kind of moment where people rush to conclusions. And it is also exactly the kind of moment where that instinct should be resisted. The most responsible approach, regardless of where you fall politically, is to slow down. Focus on what is observable. Separate confirmed facts from claims, and remain open to updating conclusions as additional evidence becomes available. That is what I aim to do here. Not to defend a party, not to attack a party, but to evaluate what we know, acknowledge what we don't, and explain why it matters. If you found this analysis useful, please like the video, leave a comment, and share it with others. That helps this channel grow and allows this kind of independent coverage to continue. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.